Hi everyone. In this video, we'll be exploring how to incorporate Keyri QR login into a Firebase application spanning a web app and mobile app. In this video, we'll be discussing the web application, and in a second video, we'll be talking through how to incorporate the Keyri SDK into a Flutter app. The net result will be that a user can use their mobile app in which they're already signed in and use it to scan a QR code on the web app in order to log in on that web app without having to input any credentials like email, password. And so here we're looking at the web app. This is a single page application that does nothing more than allow people to log in and sign up via email and password, and now through QR code. Let's get started. Let's assume that this is our starting point, an application that just has the traditional authentication method of email and password. Alternatively, it could be an array of options provided by the Firebase authentication suite, such as various OIDC options like sign in with Google, sign in with Apple, and so on. Really, our goal is simply to add QR as an additional login option, a parallel login option. Let's take a look at the application. Again, this is a very simple web application comprised of a single index.js, a single index.html. Some of the business logic is confined within UI.js. Basically, it just determines what the logged out state looks like, what the logged in state looks like. But it's index.js that actually determines whether one is logged in or logged out. And so here, it's very simple, about less than 100 lines of code. And this is a very typical kind of Firebase web app. Here we have our configuration. Here we have a function for email password login. Here we have one for creating an account. Rather importantly, here we have monitor auth state provided by the Firebase JavaScript library, logout function. So let's get started with actually incorporating Keyri into this. We'll start by adding some of the logic into index.js. Now, effectively, the way that Keyri works with Firebase is by copying the session tokens present on a logged in mobile session and embedding them into the thus far logged out web session. Firebase stores these session tokens in the browser's indexed DB, and so we will be interacting with IndexedDB here. So let's get started. We'll be harnessing the DB maker provided by all modern browsers. Here we're just targeting the Firebase local storage DB that the Firebase SDK itself opens within the web app. Next, we need to create an event listener in order to listen for events emitted by the Keyri QR widget, which we'll add momentarily. There's quite a bit here, so let's just parse through it. Here we have an event listener on message. Basically, what's happening is that the Keyri QR widget, once it's scanned and on the mobile device, the login request is accepted, the mobile app sends over a message containing various session-related credentials, namely an access token and a refresh token and other attributes about the login session. Those are then emitted by the Keyri QR widget iframe, and the outside window needs to listen to events that come out of this iframe. So the event is emitted as a JSON, and here we're just going to drill down into the data that actually matters. First of all, we have to make sure that this script is listening to events of the Keyri type. and there's no error in what's emitted. Here, you'll definitely want a console log just to make sure that a payload is coming into the web page. And so if anything goes wrong, if it's not working, you just need to make sure that the JSON actually contains the data that you need. And here's the data that you need. Effectively, these are the values that will be put into the index DB. You can just copy this verbatim. Here, we're just taking the API key from the Firebase config. And that's the kind of FBase key. That is the key within the Firebase indexed DB. So the values that you need are UID, a Boolean for whether the user's email is verified, a Boolean for whether the user is anonymous. It will always be false, but it's good to take that from the JSON that you receive from the widget. Next is an object for provider data. This is especially important if you're using OIDC, that is sign in with Google, sign in with Apple, sign in with GitHub, etc. And critically, here we're creating an STS token manager object out of a refresh token, an access token, and an expiration time for the access token. So now we've created this object that we want to put into the index DB. And with this, by opening DB Maker, and then creating a transaction, and then putting this object into this transaction, we actually are putting it into IndexedDB. And so once it's in there, Firebase's existing auth listeners, namely, monitor auth state, will pick up the fact that this object containing a fully valid session has been put into IndexedDB. And with that, the page should automatically advance to the logged in view. Let's just save. We don't need to do anything with the UI because, well, we're going to modify what the logged out screen looks like in index.html. So index.html just defines the layout of the page rather than JavaScript defining layout. So here, if we look at our starting point again, we have this div here, we have an empty div over here. We're going to put the Keyri QR widget into this empty div. First, we need to actually import the Keyri QR widget into our project. So let's just go to our distribution folder, create Keyri QR.html. Let's come to the Keyri documentation. From point number 1 here, you need to serve Keyri QR.html from the domain on which the widget will actually be loaded. So in this case, example Keyri auth.web.app. That is, it needs to be stored alongside the remainder of your web app code. So Keyri QR.html is available here. Let's just copy this, come back, paste, save. Let's come back to index.html. And now I've already handled the CSS to do the divs, but it's all fairly straightforward. Now what we're doing here is we're putting an iframe referencing KeyriQR.html into whatever div we want. In this case, we want to put it in this right side login option area. And so here it is. We're just referencing KeyriQR.html, which will be distributed alongside the remainder of our web app. And this other stuff is optional, but these are recommended defaults. You'll certainly want to have scrolling set to no. And here we just have a solid white border. We find that sometimes aids QR code readability and makes scanning it actually a little bit quicker. And that's really it. So just to summarize, in order to incorporate Keyri QR login, what you need to do is insert this Keyri logic for accessing the correct IndexedDB database, setting up an event listener that, upon receiving the correct event, creates this object containing session info, and finally puts that object into the correct IndexedDB. Then in HTML or JSX or however you'd like to do it, just insert an iframe referencing the keyriqr.html file, which you have to include in your distribution. And once you're set there, all you need to do is deploy this to the correct domain. That is the domain that you have already registered on the Keyri web app. Thanks a lot.